South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond drafted an official battle cry for states' rights, known as the Southern Manifesto. Over 100 members of Congress pledged their support for the document, which called on all Southerners to resist integration by any lawful means. But in the mid-1950s, a new generation of activists mounted a campaign of direct political action and nonviolent protest to exorcise Jim Crow and its violent legacy once and for all. Their fight for freedom and equality became known as the modern civil rights movement. For leadership, the protesters chose a young Baptist minister, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Martin Luther King brought together other black ministers and community leaders to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. With King as its president, the SCLC championed voter registration drives and supported bus boycotts in the Civil Rights Act of 1957. It was the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. The law provided new authority to the Justice Department to oversee elections and investigate officials who interfered with voter registration. It also created a new division within the Justice Department to prosecute civil rights violations, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. Younger and more aggressive than the senior civil rights organizations, SNCC members became the shock troops of the revolution, willing to take the fight to the racist enemy in the most intolerant parts of the South of Bobby Kennedy. As head of the Justice Department, he was empowered to intervene if he suspected federal laws were being violated. Bobby Kennedy began to see the civil rights debate in a new light, not as one issue among the thousands confronting the administration, but as the defining moral issue of the era.
Negroes want the same things that white citizens possess. All of their rights. They want no reservations. They want complete equality, social, economic, and political.
The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom would be the greatest mass protest in the nation's history.
Because I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
And I think this march will go down as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, demonstrations for freedom and human dignity ever held in the United States.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the most sweeping civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. It outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, religion, national origin, or gender, and banned the practice of segregation in schools, public places, and employment. In many areas, literacy tests and other forms of discrimination still prevented African Americans from voting. On August 6, 1965, just 5 months after the violence of Selma and the president's civil rights appeal to Congress, Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 5 days later, the Watts district of Los Angeles erupted in the worst race riots in the city's history. National attention was riveted on the streets of LA. But the riots there were simply manifestations of the racial tension and rage that simmered in every major U.S. city during the period. Poverty, unemployment, police harassment, unfulfilled expectations had created a tinderbox on the streets of inner-city ghettos. The civil rights movement had dismantled the Southern system of segregation and white supremacy, but it had largely ignored the insidious racism that festered elsewhere. Northern blacks were angry, disaffected, and easily seduced by fringe groups.
African Americans were undergoing a transformation of their own.
Over a period of less than a year, you had people who were calm, respectable, responsible Negroes, all of a sudden militants wearing dashikis with huge afros, taking Swahili class, identifying with the homeland. There is nothing more exhilarating or seductive than a change in consciousness. And in the 1960s, blacks made a transition, especially on the college campus, from being Negroes to being black to being Afro-American.
Magic of 1968. At the end of March in Memphis, Tennessee, garbage workers who were mostly black and grossly underpaid were out on strike.
These men who were really at the low rung on the totem pole just got tired of being treated less than men. And if you notice that sign they had, it didn't say peace, it didn't say freedom, it didn't say justice. All it said was, I am a man.
Martin Luther King, the nation's preeminent civil rights leader, came to Memphis to express moral support for the men on strike. On March 28th, the Memphis police were out in force. About 12,000 demonstrators gathered to march down Beale Street in support of the garbage workers. King was planning to lead a Poor People's March on Washington that summer, an ambitious new campaign focusing on economic justice.
There was a group of young guys called the Invaders, some of whom were on the FBI's payroll. We didn't know that at the time. But they were there really to stir up trouble. These young guys had taken the sticks off of the placards, started breaking out windows, and they started the riot. And you know, once you start, everybody gets in it. And rather than try and isolate the people who were rioting, the police just waded into the crowd, just beating people indiscriminately, just beating them. It was horrible. Martin was taken up physically, put in a car, and taken to the closest hotel for his own safety. And he said, we've got to have a peaceful march. If we don't do it here, we can't go to Washington.
King was despondent. Others were losing faith in his nonviolent philosophy. Maybe his time was past. Martin Luther King was at a crossroads. Despite doubts, despite death threats, he refused to turn back. On the night of April 3rd, he appeared before a packed congregation at Mason Temple.
I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
The next day, meeting with aides at his motel, as evening approached, he stepped out on the balcony to talk with Jesse Jackson.
And I said, Doc, he said, yes. And he said, yes, the bullet hit right here, and they just knocked him back against the wall, and it was over.
In black communities across the country, the reaction to King's assassination was a violent eruption of rage and despair. Rioting broke out in more than 100 cities. 20,000 Army regulars and 34,000 National Guardsmen were mobilized. Nationwide, 46 people died. Martin Luther King was dead. America was burning. Many feared that the last hope for racial equality and nonviolence had been extinguished.